Christmas in my small Montana town always settles in softly, like the snow is trying not to disturb anyone. That night, I was on the floor of my parents' house, wrapping gifts I'd spent all month saving for, telling myself the season still meant something warm. I cracked the window for air and heard my sister call me a useless loser. Then my father's tired voice, just tolerate her until she finishes paying for the renovation. That's when I realized I'd been funding something that wasn't what they claimed. Before I ever opened that window, before any words drifted up from the driveway, everything began in a way that felt almost ordinary. It was early winter in Montana, the kind of winter that doesn't ask permission before settling in. The first serious drop in temperature always changes the mood in town. People start checking their roofs, sealing windows, testing heaters. You don't wait until the storm hits, you prepare before it does. That's when my mom called. Her voice carried a tension I wasn't used to hearing from her. She said the lights had been flickering for days, that the electrical system was old, that if a heavy storm came through and the power failed, it could be dangerous, especially with the kind of cold we get. She didn't dramatize it, which somehow made it more believable. She just sounded worried, tired, like she'd been trying to manage it alone. I didn't question her. When she said the electrician warned that faulty wiring could cause outages in freezing weather, I felt a knot form in my stomach. The idea of my parents sitting in a dark, freezing house was enough. I asked what needed to be done. She hesitated before mentioning the cost. It was more than she expected. They hadn't planned for it. Life had been difficult, she said. They had postponed the repairs for as long as they could. She rarely asked me for anything directly. That detail mattered. So when she said they needed help, it didn't feel like manipulation. It felt serious. The first payment I sent covered an inspection. She insisted it had to be done before any real repairs could begin. I transferred the money that same night. I remember staring at my bank balance afterward, telling myself it was temporary. Just a rough month, that's all. Barrett knew about the issue. Mom had told her too. But when I gently asked whether she would be contributing, Mom defended her immediately. She said Barrett had her own struggles, that she helped in ways I didn't see, that not everything was financial. I wanted to believe that. I really did. Still, the pattern formed quickly. Every time I hinted that the responsibility felt heavy, Mom reminded me that the house was my childhood home, that they had done so much for me growing up, that family steps up when things get hard, and I agreed. More requests came over the following weeks. The electrician had found additional issues: old panels, weather exposure, outdated wiring that could become a hazard once snow accumulated. Each call carried urgency. Each explanation sounded reasonable, and each time I sent another transfer, I started adjusting my own life without making a big announcement about it. I stopped eating out. I canceled a weekend trip I'd been looking forward to. When friends invited me to dinner, I'd say I was trying to be more responsible with money, which wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. The tighter my budget became, the more I told myself it was worth it. I pictured the house, warm and steady. I imagined Mom sounding relieved instead of anxious. I held on to that image like it justified everything. Only one person really questioned it: my friend Jod. She knew I'd been helping my parents financially for a while, but when the transfers started becoming frequent and larger, she looked at me differently. Not judgmental, just cautious. "Are you sure everything's adding up?" she asked one evening after I declined another plan because I was trying to save. I laughed it off. I told her family doesn't keep score, that sometimes one person carries more weight for a while. I said it confidently enough that even I almost believed I wasn't stretching myself thin. Jo didn't push. She just told me to be careful, but careful felt unnecessary. These were my parents. The idea that I needed to protect myself from them didn't fit inside my understanding of loyalty. Helping them felt like proof that I was dependable, that I was doing the right thing. As winter deepened, the payments continued. Inspection fees, partial deposits, emergency adjustments. The explanations blended together into one steady narrative, fix it now, before the real cold hits. Dad barely spoke to me during this time. I assumed he was letting Mom handle it the way he usually did with household matters. I didn't interpret his silence as anything meaningful. If anything, I thought he was embarrassed about needing help. Looking back, what stands out most isn't the money. It's how easily I accepted the responsibility. Every transfer carried a quiet reassurance I gave myself. This is temporary. This is what good daughters do. This is what keeps families safe. Meanwhile, my own safety net shrank. I watched my savings dip to a level that made me uneasy, but I pushed the discomfort aside. I convinced myself the strain was proof of sacrifice, and sacrifice in my mind meant love. The house, I told myself, would be secure before the worst storms arrived. The wiring would be replaced. The danger would pass. And then things would settle. I didn't resent Barrett, not openly. I told myself people contribute differently. I told myself Mom knew what she was doing. I told myself this would end soon. I never stopped to ask why the urgency never seemed to resolve. Because at that point, trust filled in every gap where questions might have formed. And I kept sending the money. The morning after I overheard them, I woke up with that strange, heavy awareness that something had shifted permanently. You know that feeling when you open your eyes and for a split second you almost forget. Then it all comes back at once. I didn't rush out of bed. I just lay there staring at the ceiling, replaying the words in my head. Tolerate her until she finishes paying for the renovation. The sentence looped quietly, almost calmly. It didn't sound dramatic anymore. It sounded calculated. Instead of confronting anyone, I made tea. I needed something steady in my hands before I started pulling at threads that might unravel everything. I sat at the kitchen table and opened my banking app. The list of transfers stretched down the screen: inspection fees, partial payments, emergency adjustments. Every memo was simple. Repairs, electrical, urgent. At first it looked normal, familiar. Then I started writing down the dates. I don't know why that detail mattered so much, but once I began listing them chronologically, something felt off. The urgency in her calls had always sounded immediate, almost overlapping. Yet the payments were spaced in a way that didn't match the tone she used. There were gaps, repeats, clusters that didn't make sense. I enlarged a few of the receipts she had sent me months earlier. Some were clear invoices, others weren't. A few were cropped screenshots. No company header, no verification codes, just partial totals and brief descriptions. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. Why would I? I trusted the narrative more than the paperwork. While I was still comparing dates, I heard Mom's voice in the living room. She was on the phone. Her tone caught my attention immediately. It wasn't the soft worry she used with me. It was sharper, more assertive, almost transactional. I moved quietly toward the hallway and paused near the half-closed door. My heart was beating faster than I expected. Not from fear exactly, but from the sense that something important was about to surface. I opened my phone and hit record. I didn't think, I just did it. She was talking about the renovation, about delays, about additional work that needed to be scheduled. But the details didn't match what she had told me. She mentioned an electrician's name I had never heard before. She referred to an additional payment that supposedly covered winter protection measures. She described the timeline as if certain inspections had been postponed, yet I distinctly remembered transferring money specifically to avoid those delays. The contradictions stacked quietly one over another. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening to her discuss amounts that had never appeared in my banking history. She referenced deposits that didn't exist, adjustments had never been told about. When she spoke about finalizing the major work, my stomach tightened. Major work? There had never been a final invoice, never a completion update, just more urgency. The call lasted long enough for me to capture several clear statements. When she finally hung up, I returned to the kitchen and replayed the recording with headphones. Hearing it again felt different, colder. I paused after each mention of a date or payment and compared it to the notes I had written down. The inconsistencies weren't subtle anymore. They were precise, specific, measurable, and that was the part that hurt most. This wasn't confusion, it wasn't miscommunication, it was structured. I opened my email and searched for every message she had sent about the repairs. I checked timestamps. I compared them to the dates she referenced on the call. The gaps were too large to ignore. Weeks where she claimed work was underway, but no payments had been made. Claims of urgency long after inspections were supposedly completed. Each discovery didn't explode emotionally the way I expected. Instead, it settled inside me slowly, like ice forming underwater. I felt betrayed, but not loudly, not dramatically. It was quieter than that. A kind of disbelief that made me question my own judgment more than her behavior. How had I not noticed? I pulled up older bank statements and scrolled further back than I ever had before. I didn't jump to conclusions. I didn't accuse anyone in my mind. I just observed. Transfers aligned with her calls, but some payments she mentioned on the recording didn't exist in my records. Others were larger than what she had described. There were references to deposits I had never authorized. I wrote everything down. Date, claimed purpose, actual transfer, missing documentation. The page filled quickly at one point. I had to stop because my hands were shaking. Not from anger, but from the realization that I was documenting something I never thought I'd need to prove. Part of me wanted to walk into the living room and ask a simple question. Just one. Why? But I didn't. Confrontation without evidence would only turn into deflection. I knew that instinctively. So, I stayed quiet. I kept collecting. By late morning, my tea had gone cold. The house felt different, not hostile, just exposed, like the air had shifted. I gathered every receipt I could find, archived emails, text messages, screenshots, even the small memos attached to each transfer. Patterns began forming, not dramatic ones. Just small fractures in the story I had believed so completely. And as I sat there surrounded by papers and open tabs, I understood something clearly for the first time. If the urgency had been real, the documentation would have been consistent. Instead, I had fragments. And fragments, when lined up carefully, tell their own story. I didn't say anything that day. I didn't accuse. I didn't argue. I didn't even hint that I was beginning to see the cracks. I just kept gathering the truth quietly, because whatever this was, it wasn't going to survive daylight. A week later, I found myself standing outside the local electric company watching my breath, fog in the cold Montana air. I remember thinking how ordinary the building looked. Beige siding, frost along the edges of the windows. Nothing about it hinted that it was about to confirm something I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. Inside, the lobby was quiet. A receptionist asked how she could help, and I explained that I needed to verify service records for my parents' address. My voice sounded steady, almost detached, like I was helping someone else untangle their problem. She directed me to a technician named Leonard. Leonard didn't look intimidating or dramatic. He looked like someone who had spent years answering practical questions and fixing practical problems. When I explained that I had been making payments for electrical repairs and needed to confirm what work had been done, his expression shifted. Slightly, not suspicious, just attentive. He asked for the address and the approximate dates. I handed him the list I had prepared. My handwriting looked more composed than I felt. He scrolled through his system slowly, carefully. The room was quiet except for the faint clicking of his mouse. Each second stretched longer than it should have. Then he cleared his throat. The first thing he said was simple. There had been no major electrical repairs scheduled during the months I provided. Not delayed, not pending, not scheduled. I blinked, waiting for the clarification that would make the sentence less final. But it didn't come. He continued in that same careful tone. According to their records, there had been a minor inspection earlier in the season, a routine panel reset, some cleaning, standard preventative maintenance. Nothing urgent, nothing inexpensive. The total cost of the documented work was significantly lower than the amounts I had transferred. I felt my stomach tighten, but I asked him to check again. I told him maybe it was under a contractor's name. Maybe there were deposits. Maybe it hadn't been finalized yet. He nodded and double-checked. He even rotated the screen slightly toward me, pointing to the service log. Dates, notes, technician initials, everything recorded in a clean chronological order. 2 larger repair appointments had been scheduled earlier in the winter, he said, but they were rescheduled and eventually canceled. Canceled. I stared at that word longer than anything else on the page. There were no advance deposits listed in their payment system, no partial installments, no pending balances attached to future repairs. If any third party had been paid, he added gently, it hadn't gone through their company. That sentence settled heavier than the rest. He offered to print a detailed service summary for me. I nodded. I wasn't sure if I trusted my memory in that moment. I needed something physical, something I could hold. When the printer hummed to life, I felt a strange mix of validation and dread. Validation because the doubts I'd been quietly building weren't irrational. Dread because confirmation changes things. Outside in the parking lot, I didn't get into my car right away. I leaned against the door and opened my banking app again. The winter air bit at my fingers as I scrolled through the transfers. Inspection fee, emergency electrical adjustment, panel upgrade deposit, Stormproofing advance. I held the printed service summary in one hand and my phone in the other, comparing dates. The inspection Leonard mentioned matched the first payment I sent. That much was true. But the larger transfers, the urgent follow-ups, the supposed deposits for major repairs, there was no trace of them in the official record. No urgency, no escalating danger, no looming winter catastrophe that required immediate funding. Just a minor inspection and routine maintenance. The realization didn't hit like an explosion. It settled slowly. For months, I had been responding to panic, to flickering lights and warnings about freezing storms. I had pictured my parents sitting in darkness, vulnerable and exposed. But the timeline in my hands told a different story. There had been no race against winter, no electrical crisis spiraling out of control. The urgency I had felt so deeply had never existed in the way it was described to me. I thought about the calls, the tone in my mother's voice, the repeated emphasis on danger, on responsibility, on how the house, my childhood home, needed me. Standing there in that parking lot, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, not yet. Clarity. Every transfer I had made suddenly felt less like generosity and more like a response to a carefully constructed narrative, one that relied on my fear, on my loyalty, on my assumption that parents don't fabricate emergencies. I folded the service summary and placed it carefully in my bag. I didn't storm back inside. I didn't call anyone from the parking lot. I didn't rehearse confrontations in my head. I just sat in my car for a few minutes, letting the silence settle around me. The heater hummed softly as I looked through the windshield at the snow beginning to fall. For the first time since that night by the window, the pieces weren't abstract anymore. They were documented. And documentation doesn't argue. It just sits there waiting for you to decide what you're going to do with it. When I got home, I didn't collapse into emotion. I cleared the kitchen table. There's something grounding about physical order when your thoughts feel crowded. I laid out the service summary from the electric company on one side. On the other, I stacked printed receipts Mom had sent me over the past few months. Then I opened my laptop and pulled up my full transaction history. This time I wasn't looking for reassurance. I was looking for patterns. The legitimate inspection fee matched Leonard's report. That part was real. But as I moved down the list, the numbers started drifting further away from anything that resembled routine electrical work. I enlarged the digital copies of receipts Mom had forwarded. A few were clear and complete with business names and invoice numbers. Others were strangely cropped. No headers, no full totals. Some didn't even show dates, just partial screenshots with vague descriptions like service adjustment or winter upgrade. At the time, I hadn't questioned the formatting. Now, the missing details felt intentional. I cross-checked the dates of my transfers with her messages. In several cases, I had sent money days before any official service appointment was ever logged. In others, she referenced urgent follow-ups that never appeared in the electric company's records. Then I noticed something else. As I dug deeper into the joint maintenance account, the one she said was strictly for household repairs, I found transactions that had nothing to do with electricity at all. Small purchases at boutiques she liked, payments to a loan service she once mentioned casually and never explained, charges that lined up perfectly with the weeks she told me costs had unexpectedly increased. I stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't just that the repair story had been exaggerated. My money had been covering more than wires and panels. It had been filling gaps I was never told about. The realization didn't break me the way I once imagined betrayal would. There were no tears, no dramatic gasps, just a steady pressure behind my ribs that slowly turned into something firmer. Resolve. I created a folder on my desktop and labeled it simply documentation. Into it went everything. Screenshots of every transfer, copies of each receipt, the service summary Leonard printed, archived emails, text messages where urgency was emphasized. I saved audio files of the recorded phone call and labeled them with dates and short descriptions. I wasn't collecting ammunition. I was collecting clarity. The more I organized, the calmer I felt. It was as if each saved file shifted power back into my hands. Facts don't raise their voices. They don't beg. They don't accuse. They just exist. When I logged back into the joint account and reviewed the remaining balance, I noticed how quickly it had shrunk over the year. Alerts I had dismissed before now felt like quiet warnings I chose not to hear. I transferred the remaining funds into my personal account. My finger hovered over the confirmation button for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood what it represented. This wasn't just about money. It was about stepping out of a system that depended on my silence and automatic compliance. I confirmed the transfer. Then I removed my access from the shared financial platform entirely. I changed my passwords. I disabled automatic notifications tied to that account. I took final screenshots of the transaction history before closing the tab. The house was quiet while I did all of this. Mom moved somewhere in the background, unaware that the structure she relied on was quietly dissolving. I didn't confront her, not yet. Confrontation would invite denial, emotion, distraction, and I didn't need noise. I needed stability. By the time I closed my laptop, the light outside had shifted toward evening. The winter sky looked pale and distant. Inside, though, something felt solid. I wasn't reacting anymore. I wasn't funding uncertainty. For the first time in months, my actions weren't guided by fear of what might happen if I didn't help. They were guided by the simple decision not to participate in something that no longer aligned with the truth. And I chose silence, not because I was weak, but because silence in that moment carried more control than any argument ever could. The quiet didn't last long. That afternoon, my phone started vibrating across the table like it had somewhere urgent to be. Mom's name flashed on the screen once, twice, 3 times. I let it ring, not to be cruel, just to breathe. When the calls finally paused, a text came through almost immediately. She said she had just received a notice from the electric company. There was an additional penalty fee attached to an overdue balance. She didn't understand how it happened. Automatic payments must have failed. Something had gone wrong. Her message was scattered, half explanation, half panic. I read it slowly. The tone was familiar. Urgency wrapped in confusion. A problem that needed immediate fixing. And unspoken but obvious. The expectation that I would step in. I didn't answer right away. The phone rang again. This time, when I picked up, her voice was tight and breathless. She said the situation was serious, that if the penalty wasn't addressed quickly, the balance would escalate. That winter wasn't forgiving, and delays could be dangerous. Dangerous, that word again. I listened without interrupting. I didn't correct her. I didn't argue. I just let her speak until the urgency began to circle back on itself. When she finally paused, waiting for my response, I told her calmly that I no longer had access to the joint account. There was silence, then disbelief. What do you mean you don't have access? I explained evenly that I had transferred the remaining funds and removed myself from the platform. My voice didn't rise. It didn't shake. It sounded unfamiliar even to me, steady in a way I hadn't practiced. She insisted there must be a misunderstanding. She suggested I temporarily transfer something to buy time, just until she sorted out the billing error. It would only take a small amount, she said, just to prevent further complications. I told her I couldn't continue supporting a system that operated on incomplete information. She tried to interrupt, but I kept speaking, not loudly, just clearly. I said I needed transparency. I said I couldn't keep responding to emergencies that never fully materialized. Her tone shifted from urgent to wounded. After everything we've done for you, the guilt wasn't new, but it landed differently this time. Softer, less effective. Before she could rebuild momentum, another call came through. Barrett, I answered. She didn't bother with greetings. What did you do? Her voice was sharp, already loaded with blame. She said Mom was overwhelmed, that the household was falling apart because I decided to pull something dramatic. I held the phone slightly away from my ear and let her talk. Anger spills faster when no one interrupts it. She accused me of trying to control everyone, of sabotaging the family right before Christmas, of wanting to ruin everything. The same sentence surfaced again. You just want to ruin everything, don't you? I waited until she ran out of breath. Then I said evenly, ask Mom what she said last night. Silence, not confusion, hesitation. She muttered that she had no idea what I was talking about, but the confidence in her voice had thinned. I didn't elaborate. I didn't explain. I just repeated it. Ask Mom what she said last night. The line wasn't aggressive. It wasn't emotional. It was factual. And that's what shifted the balance. For the first time, they weren't responding to my feelings. They were reacting to the possibility of exposure. Barrett's tone changed slightly, less explosive and more uncertain. She tried to pivot back to logistics penalties, deadlines, the cold weather. But the energy had shifted. The accusations no longer landed with certainty. I ended the call shortly after saying I had another call coming through. Mom resumed dialing within seconds. This time, her voice carried more fear than frustration. She emphasized the timing, the season, the stress she had been under. She reminded me how complicated everything had become. I listened. Then I said calmly that I would not be transferring any more money. She tried one last time, softening her tone, leaning into vulnerability. She said she didn't understand why I was acting this way. I answered simply, I heard everything. She didn't respond immediately, and in that pause, I felt something settle into place. The power dynamic that had existed for months, maybe years, was no longer automatic. I wasn't scrambling to fix. I wasn't rushing to reassure. I wasn't absorbing the panic. I was steady. The calls eventually slowed. The messages became shorter, less certain. For the first time, urgency didn't control me. Silence did, and I held it carefully. 3 days later, there was a knock at my door. Not a hesitant one. Not the kind where someone waits to see if you're home. It was firm, decisive. Like she had rehearsed the posture before she even left the driveway. When I opened it, Mom stood there with her shoulders squared, lips pressed into a thin line that tried to look composed, but her eyes were moving, scanning past me, searching for something softer in my expression. I stepped aside and let her in. Before she crossed the threshold, I opened the voice recorder on my phone and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't announce it. I didn't need to. She walked into the living room and didn't sit down. That was the first sign she hadn't come to talk, she'd come to control the narrative. She started quickly. The situation with the electric company had been exaggerated. There was a clerical error. The penalty fees were misunderstandings. She had been handling everything responsibly. The timing was unfortunate. The stress of the season had made things look worse than they were. Her tone shifted as she spoke. Frustration at first, then wounded disbelief, then forced calm. I listened without interrupting. She avoided mentioning the conversation in the driveway. She spoke as if the only issue was my sudden overreaction, as if the financial separation had appeared out of nowhere. When she finally paused, waiting for me to respond, I said quietly, I heard every word. The color drained from her face in a way that no raised voice ever could have caused. She blinked. Heard what? The conversation in the driveway. You and Barrett. Her denial came quickly, almost reflexively. She said she would never say anything unkind about me, that I must have misunderstood, that words get twisted when overheard. Her voice trembled slightly, not from anger, but from calculation. She was trying to assess how much I knew. I let her speak for another minute, long enough for the recorder to capture every contradiction layered over the previous ones. Then I took my phone out. Without saying anything else, I pressed play. Her own voice filled the room, clear, undeniable. I don't want to spend Christmas with that useless loser. Barrett's voice followed, sharp, dismissive. And then Mom again, steady and resigned. Just tolerate her a little longer until she finishes paying for the renovation. The sound of it changed the air. Mom didn't interrupt the recording. She couldn't. We both stood there as the final words echoed and faded into silence. When it ended, the room felt heavier than it had moments before. She tried to recover, said it was taken out of context, said she was frustrated, said I didn't understand the pressure she'd been under, that families say things in private they don't mean. But the defense sounded thin even to her. Before she could rebuild momentum, my phone lit up again. Barrett, I answered and placed the call on speaker. What is wrong with you? Barrett demanded immediately. Mom said you're trying to humiliate her. Mom inhaled sharply beside me, realizing she no longer controlled the framing of the situation. Barrett's voice filled the room, angry and defensive. She said I was creating chaos, that Mom had been under unbearable stress, that I was choosing the worst possible time to make a scene. Then she repeated it. You just want to ruin everything, don't you? I waited until she finished. Then I said the same sentence I had said before, my voice level and even. Ask Mom what she said last night. There was a pause, a long one. Barrett didn't answer right away. She didn't deny it either. Mom looked at me, eyes wide, not pleading this time, but cornered. When Barrett started speaking again, her anger had thinned into something more uncertain. She pivoted back to the financial issue, the penalties, the cold, the bills. I let her talk. Then I said clearly, so both of them could hear without distortion, I will not be providing any more money. Not now, not later. No shouting, no shaking hands. Just a statement. Mom tried once more to soften her tone. She stepped closer, lowering her voice, as if intimacy might repair what had broken. She said timing mattered, that misunderstandings shouldn't cost family this much. I stayed near the doorway. I won't fund something built on secrecy, I said. The words didn't feel dramatic, they felt settled. When the call ended and the room fell quiet again, Mom stood there for a moment longer. The rehearsed explanations had run out. The shifting tones had nowhere left to go. Eventually, she walked toward the door. When it closed behind her, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt defined. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to their version of events. I was standing inside my own. Christmas night felt softer at Aunt Marcy's house. The air smelled like cinnamon and roasted pecans, and the living room glowed with lamplight instead of harsh overhead bulbs. A real fire crackled in the fireplace, throwing gold across the walls. Simone sat curled at the edge of the couch, a mug warming her hands, listening to her aunt laugh in the kitchen as she insisted everyone take home leftovers. It wasn't extravagant. The plates didn't match. The tree leaned slightly to one side, but nothing felt strained. No one whispered in corners. No one performed gratitude while calculating what it cost. Her phone buzzed for the first time just after 9. She didn't look at it immediately. She already knew. When she finally turned the screen over, she saw 3 missed calls from her mother. 2 from Barrett. A text preview. Why is the power acting strange? Did you move money? Call me. She exhaled slowly and set the phone face down on the coffee table. Across town, she imagined the house in darkness. The electric company's grace period had ended that afternoon. She'd known it would. She'd confirmed it quietly when she withdrew her remaining funds and removed herself from the joint account. She hadn't canceled anything. She'd simply stepped away. The responsibility had shifted back to where it belonged. Her phone buzzed again, this time a rapid series of messages. Simone, this is serious. There are penalty fees now. You can't just abandon us on Christmas. Barrett says, this is because you're angry. Stop being dramatic. She read each one carefully, feeling the old reflex to explain, to soothe, to solve. But she didn't answer. Aunt Marcy returned to the living room, carrying a plate of pie. Everything okay? She asked gently, noticing the tension Simone tried to hide. Simone smiled small but real. Yeah, I'm okay. And she was. The phone rang again. This time it was her father. She hesitated before answering, stepping quietly into the hallway so she wouldn't interrupt the warm hum of conversation behind her. Dad. His voice was lower than usual. Not angry, not panicked, just tired. The lights went out, he said. Whole house is dark. In the background, she could hear her mother's sharper tone, accusations flying, words like irresponsible and punishment slipping through the line. Barrett's voice layered on top, louder, angrier, blaming her outright. Dad didn't join them. There were notices, he said quietly, almost to himself. I remember seeing something. Simone closed her eyes. There were, she said evenly. A long pause followed. Your mom said you were handling it, he added. Simone didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't defend herself. She didn't recount the transfers or the confirmations or the printed service summaries, proving the urgency never existed. I'm not handling it anymore, she said calmly. Another pause. He understood more than he was willing to say. Outside their house, she knew the neighborhood was glowing. Windows lit with Christmas trees, inflatable snowmen humming softly on lawns, porch lights twinkling. And in the middle of it, her parents' house sat dark. Neighbors would notice. They always did. Her phone lit up again with Barrett's name flashing across the screen. She let it ring until it stopped. From the living room, someone started a slow, off-key rendition of a carol. Laughter followed. Glasses clinked. The fire popped. Simone slipped the phone into her bag. For the first time in weeks, her chest felt light, not triumphant, not vindictive, just unburdened. She walked back into the living room and sat down beside her aunt, accepting a slice of pie. The warmth of the room wrapped around her again. The house across town remained dark, and Simone did not step back in. The week after Christmas was quieter than Simone expected. No dramatic showdowns, no final explosions, just silence, and the steady hum of her own life returning to her. On the first Monday after the holiday, she sat at her kitchen table, with a notebook, a cup of coffee, and her laptop open to her banking dashboard. For the first time in months, the numbers on the screen reflected only her reality, her income, her expenses, her future. She created folders, utilities, savings, taxes, emergency fund. She adjusted automatic transfers. She set a realistic monthly budget that didn't include mysterious, urgent repairs or last-minute transfers marked family support. Each click felt small but decisive. She wasn't scrambling anymore. The absence of constant financial strain created space in her mind she hadn't realized was crowded. She slept through the night. She stopped checking her phone the moment it buzzed. It still buzzed, of course. Her mother's messages shifted. Tones almost daily, first indignant, then wounded, then nostalgic. After everything we've done for you, families don't turn their backs on each other. Your father is stressed. Is that what you wanted? Barrett's messages were sharper, shorter, accusatory. He sent screenshots of late notices, hints about fees, dramatic statements about consequences. Simone read none of them immediately. Sometimes she didn't read them at all. She muted the threads and placed the conversations in an archived folder she labeled simply "not mine to fix." It wasn't coldness, it was clarity. In the afternoons, she found herself noticing ordinary things again. The way sunlight pooled across her living room floor, the comfort of cooking a simple dinner without calculating how many extra portions she might need to finance elsewhere, the quiet satisfaction of paying her own electric bill early and receiving confirmation without anxiety. She went for walks without replaying arguments in her head. She called a friend and actually listened instead of waiting for the next crisis alert. The lightness surprised her most. For years, she had equated generosity with endurance, believing love meant absorbing pressure without complaint. That if she just gave enough, solved enough, covered enough, stability would eventually settle over everyone. But generosity without accountability had quietly become permission. And boundaries, she realized, were not punishments. They were measurements, lines that clarified where her responsibility ended and someone else's began. Emotional independence felt less like rebellion and more like alignment. She wasn't angry every morning. She wasn't rehearsing speeches or defending herself in imaginary conversations. She simply woke up and handled what was hers. The difference was profound. She understood now that accountability doesn't thrive in silence filled with rescue. It emerges when rescue steps back. When people must respond to the consequences of their own decisions. And perhaps the hardest lesson of all love is not proven by self-erasure. As the week drew to a close, Simone reviewed her savings account one more time. The number wasn't enormous. It didn't need to be. It was stable, growing slowly, intentionally. She closed her laptop and sat still for a moment, hands resting on the table. Nothing dramatic had happened. No apologies had arrived. No sudden revelations from the other side. But inside her, something had shifted permanently. She no longer felt responsible for carrying what was never hers to hold. And in that quiet, steady space, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: peace. If this story resonated with you, you're not alone. So many people carry quiet burdens, believing love requires endless sacrifice. It doesn't. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are clarity. Sharing this isn't about blame, it's about reclaiming peace. If you found comfort or strength here, consider liking, subscribing, or staying for the next story. Sometimes healing begins simply by hearing that someone else chose themselves and survived.